Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. If you go to the next slide, we'll do some quick introductions. For those that don't know me, my name is Tony Tomarchio. I'm the head of technical operations and support for the 8 team here at Niantic. And I'm joined by my awesome team, Ian Curtis and Evan Carlson, both developer support engineers. You've probably interacted with one or maybe even all of us via Slack or email in the past, but if you haven't, welcome. It's great to be connected here today. We have a lot of great content to go through in this webinar. If you go to the next slide, we're going to be addressing some of the top areas that developers have issues and questions. Some of the areas where we regularly get questions are things like assets and animations, connected domains, publishing and how URLs work, VPS, playing audio, iOS quirks, and much more. So we have a lot of content to cover here today. We're going to cover all of these topics, plus I'm sure more based on your questions in today's session. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to start by turning things over to Ian, and Ian's going to go through some of the common challenges related to assets and animations. So Ian, take it away.
Hey everybody, Ian here on the developer support team at 8 and I'm going to be talking about things that go hand in hand with augmented reality, is the virtual components, 3D assets, and animations. So to start off here, I have two quick videos kind of showcasing some common problems that you may see when developing WebAR experiences. On the right, I'm spawning a bunch of Game Boy 3D models, which haven't been optimized as well as they should be. And here I'm spawning like 100 plus. And so I'm getting this crashed page. And so this is just kind of a quick video showcasing one of those problems that can happen. On the left here, we have a sandcastle model, which I've replaced with a super 8K texture, which is something we don't suggest doing. And in some cases, you're going to get kind of this black texture bug when doing that. And so just to kind of go over, this is going to include Safari crashes, long load times, FPS decline, black textures, crashes due to memory overhead. And these are going to be kind of some problems that are associated with 3D models during WebAR experiences. But the good thing is that these can all be solved with some helpful tips that I'll give coming up here. So to first start, I'm just going to go over kind of the model that we suggest when creating 8th wall or WebAR experiences. This is going to be a GLB, which is also the GLTF binary version of file format. And we recommend this when you're building with the cloud editor or if you're building a self-hosted project using 8th wall. And then I'm going to kind of go over the optimization checklist. So talk about how to optimize your textures, kind of about the polygon count of 3D models, how to optimize that, and then also other compression methods, as well as using our debug mode when developing and creating 8th wall experiences. And then lastly, I'll end it with kind of talking about some 3D model animations. And then on the video here on the right, you can see this kind of like super high detailed shoe and the shark and kind of all these objects floating around. This is a VPS experience. And what I've already done in this experience is that you can kind of get this high fidelity, high quality of 3D models if you kind of follow these optimization steps and have a smooth FPS running 8th wall experience. Cool. So we'll start with textures. We always suggest having your textures at the power of 2, such as 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, and maximizing around 2048 by 2048 texture sizes. We suggest this because these experiences are going to be on mobile devices, which have a relatively small screen size. So you're not going to want to be adding like an 8K texture. We've even seen like 12K textures on, these mobile experiences. Is you're kind of overkill in that aspect. And you can really get some really nice quality of your textures and 3D models with compressing and minimizing those texture sizes. One thing we suggest to kind of quickly optimize textures is a website called GLTF Report, and essentially allows you to upload a 3D model, and then you can run some quick script, which will optimize the textures to your specified texture size, and then you can now export that model with the optimized textures. And so that's a screenshot here on the right of that GLTF viewer. And then again, going to that that texture problem with that 8K texture on a 3D model turning black, which can happen on iOS Safari. And this is a one way to fix that problem if you ever run into that. Next slide, please. Great, and next we'll talk about polygon count. If you're unfamiliar with this concept, the polygon count is just the amount of triangles that build the 3D model or compile it. And if we take a look at the image on the right there, we can kind of see an array of different polygon counts for a head 3D model. On the right, we have a higher density of polygons, and on the left is kind of more simplified. And so a great way to think about this is kind of finding an in-between, something that you can still kind of see the high fidelity and the detail within your 3D model, but not so little that it kind of isn't representing what the 3D model actually looks like. So something in the middle is what I would suggest when creating 3D models. And so, if you have a 3D model and it is a really high polygon count, you can certainly optimize this by decimating the 3D mesh. And so Blender has a decimate tool, which you essentially can add as a modifier to a 3D model, and then it essentially reduces the polygon count. And you can kind of maneuver the amount of optimization you want to make. And then other things, removing unnecessary geometry. If you have some, hidden behind meshes in your 3D model, it's always good just to remove those so they're not being rendered in the scene. And then, just simplifying the structure of the 3D model as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then lastly is kind of compression and debug mode. Debug mode is something that I use pretty much every time when building with 8th Wall. It gives you some really nice, quick UI, real-time stats of the experience you're building. And this can quickly be added if you're using A-Frame in an 8th Wall experience on the cloud editor. It'll give you FPS, your triangle count, draw calls, texture sizes, and some other useful information. And so, when I'm building, I'm adding models and adding new logic. And this is just a really helpful way for me while developing to understand, when I add a new model or add some new logic, how that's kind of changing the overall FPS and overall experience. And Draco compression is also a great thing to add if you're building with 8th Wall. This can significantly reduce the file size of 3D models and can quickly be added just with a small script tag in your 8th Wall experiences. Next slide, please. And then lastly, a kind of a small little quirk here with 3D animations is just, making sure those run correctly before bringing it into an 8th Wall experience. So we like to suggest going to a GLTF viewer website where you can essentially upload your 3D model. You can check the animations, make sure they're running correctly in this GLTF viewer before moving it into your 8th Wall experience. We've had developers in the past which will be like, oh, my animations are running correctly in my 3D modeling software. And then when they bring it to 8th Wall, those models aren't running correctly. It really comes down to the ability to make sure those animations are correctly being exported to a GLB or GLTF file type. And so once you've verified those animations can run correctly, you can use those with the animation mixer component in an 8th Wall experience. And then kind of a last little quirk here specific to animations is sometimes where the camera will call out or kind of hide a 3D object. So in the video on the right here, you can see that the user is moving their camera and this tiger here is just disappearing. And so what can happen with this is usually with baked animation or rigged models is that the character can be scaled really large or small, and the camera is kind of essentially designating that character's root as where the camera is pointing to. And so in this experience, it thinks the root is in a different location, and so it's calling out the 3D model for optimization purposes, and this can kind of be distracting, and this can easily be fixed with a no call component, which essentially adds some logic so that the 3D model is not being called while the camera is being moved within the scene. Next slide, please. And then my last slide here is just going to talk about the scale systems in eighth wall. Our default scale is relative scale. And so if you're opening any eighth wall SLAM-based experience, your experience is going to open relative to from the distance of the camera to the surface that you're opening it to. And so this means if you're opening your experience, with your mobile device really close to your computer or on a table right in front of you, the virtual objects are going to scale accordingly. So they're going to be, virtually small if you open it on a table, but you could open it on the top of a building and they will seem to be a lot bigger. But the essence here is that the scale or the amount of room they'll take up on the camera is going to be the same. So you open it on a desk, if the model takes up about a third of the screen space, it's going to take about a third of the screen space on if you open it at the top of the building, even though the virtual objects are going to be a lot bigger in scale size. And then second, you can change to absolute scale, which essentially just allows you to bring virtual objects into eighth wall experiences at their true actual scale. And with that, I will bring it over to Evan.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. My name is Evan, also here as a developer support engineer on the 8Talks team. So I'm going to start by talking about one of our core features, Lightship VPS, that a lot of customers reach out specifically about the tracking and localizability of certain VPS wayspots. So the first part of developing a great VPS experience is choosing a great location for your VPS experience. Here are some visuals on good wayspots, not so good wayspots. You can see on the left side, this wayspot has a clear focal point. It has a lot of distinct features, and for the most part, it's not reflective or transparent. In contrast, the second photo does not have a clear focal point, and there's not many distinct features on the walls, and the floor is a repeating pattern. So this one won't track quite as well as the first wayspot. It probably won't localize as quick as the first wayspot. If you want to develop larger scale AR content, perhaps augment a building or tower, you'll still need to choose a wayspot that's directly in front of the user and follows those same guidelines. So if I wanted to augment the Quake Tower, I would probably choose this statue that sits at the base of the tower to have users localize against, and then offset the AR content on the tower based on that statue's position. So again, these guidelines are really important to making the tracking and localizability perform well. So we have more in-depth guidelines in our documentation, but on a high level, make sure there's a focal point, make sure there's distinct features, and try to avoid reflective and transparent materials. The next part of developing a great VPS experience is leaving time to get everything completed. Wayspot nominations, that is, if the wayspot is not already in the geospatial browser, can take up to 2 business days. You can add scans while your wayspot is being approved, and you'll need to upload a total of 10 scans at minimum. The first and the last scan need to be at least 5 hours apart to account for changes in lighting conditions. And finally, when it comes time to activate or reactivate your wayspot for your experience, that can take up to 4 hours. So it's important that you don't wait to do these things until the day before you're launching. It is tempting to use a private scan all the way throughout development, but don't forget about the timeline and planning that comes along with the actual wayspot portion of VPS experiences. Also, I've linked here is just a quick tips video on our YouTube channel, which walks you through the end-to-end process of creating a VPS experience if you haven't done that before. Cool. Finally, I'll touch on remote authoring. So we have developed some components that make it really easy to develop VPS and Sky Effect experiences without going to the physical location or running this on your mobile device. So these GIFs you can see on the screen are vanilla A-frame scenes. that I've added the desktop development component and Sky Remote authoring component to. And then that enables me to use the A-frame inspector to position content and then take those values into my code. So this is a really key portion. This is a really key part of developing VPS and Sky experiences when you don't want to run this on your mobile device or go to that specific location. Cool. So that covers some tips on VPS. More broadly, this is applicable to any of our core features. If you want to use some external libraries, for example, in these screenshots, I am using a confetti library where it really just comes with one function called confetti, and that just shows some confetti 2D on the page. We use this in our See Santa Fly experience. When users took a photo of Santa in the sky, we would spray some confetti over the screen. So to use an external library like this, you might be used to using npm to install something and then importing it at the top of your file. In the cloud editor, things are a little bit different since everything is happening at runtime. To use an external library like you would with npm, you'll need to use a JavaScript module in your head HTML. So the first screenshot shows the syntax of creating a JavaScript module on head.html. You can use the import statement to import a variable or object from a CDN pre-optimized for the browser, or you can use your own bundle using a tool like Rollup. And then we just load those objects and variables to the window. Then later, if in our A-frame component or in any other file, we can reference that same variable from the window object. So if you want to see this in action, you can view the sample project in our libraries titled External Libraries. Great. Let's see. Next up is loading unsupported file types. So a lot of times you'll want to upload a specific type of file for your experience, perhaps GLSL file if you want to implement some custom shaders or something like that. You'll see an error when dragging and dropping that type of file into the cloud editor. To work around that, all you need to use is an asset bundle. So if you click the little plus icon next to the assets pane in the left side of the cloud editor, you can upload an asset bundle, drag and drop your file there and set the main file accordingly. And then you can just reference that asset bundle just as a normal file. So we get a lot of questions on how to upload file types that are not supported in the cloud editor, but really any file type is supported by way of an asset bundle. Cool. Next, another common question we get is, how do I reference an asset in a JavaScript file? A lot of times someone will reference a relative path. For example, in the screenshot below, I am creating an image variable, and if I remove this require statement, it's really just a string, and this is going to throw a build error, which is shown right above the code snippet. So this looks really scary. It's just plain text on a white page, and can be a little jarring when you're previewing your experience. Just look at the bottom of all of this text. It'll tell you more about the error. Here it says module not found, cannot resolve asset/image. So the key here is wrapping all of your relative paths in a require statement. This is kind of just a quirk of doing everything at runtime with Webpack. So make sure if you see an error like this, just quickly check what the error is. It should point you in the right direction. And just make sure you're using require statements in your JavaScript files when referencing asset paths. Awesome. Now I am going to pass it over to Tony to talk a bit about publishing URLs and domains.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. So yeah, next we're going to talk about some common questions and blockers or issues that we see related to URLs and custom domains. So this is more kind of the infrastructure piece of our talk here today. So the first question that we get asked probably multiple times a week is where a user signs up for 8th Wall. They create a WebAR experience, they publish it via the cloud editor, and then they go to the URL. And when accessing the URL of the project, they're redirected back to the featured project page on 8thwall.com. And then there's this launch button to click. So the question we get all the time is, well, how can a user get directly into the experience without first being redirected to this featured project page? So This is tied to your plan. If you're on the starter plan, this is actually working as designed. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the Plus, Pro, and Enterprise plans support a feature we call direct URL access. So if you're on the starter plan, users get redirected first back to the associated featured project page on 8Talks.com. Users click the launch button, and then they can begin the experience. Now, note that subsequent page reloads, doesn't continue to redirect you. So, Pablo, actually, if you can go back one slide just for a moment, I want to get that screenshot. So, a follow-up question, or you might be thinking, well, why don't I just bookmark this like launch link or click on it and copy the QR code there and just use that as a way to bypass it? Well, my answer to that question is don't do it. The launch link and the associated QR code are actually temporary. So these are recycled, and new temporary links are regenerated daily. So don't try to bookmark or use these. Otherwise, the following day they're going to be broken. So you always want to use the actual URL of your project that can be displayed on the, in the cloud editor, on the project dashboard page. And if you want to enable direct URLs, you can very easily, upgrade your plan. So if you go to the next slide, I created a short link. This takes you directly to the right place in the documentation, 8th.io/change-plan. You can also manage this yourself, via the account page. So that's a question that we get, all the time here. If we can go to the next slide. So we also get a lot of questions about, using 8th Wall Cloud Editor and 8th Wall hosting, but using custom domains. So if we take a step back for a moment, I just want to first review the default URL structure for Cloud Editor projects. So you can see I have an example there with some highlighted pieces in red. And the default URL for an 8th Wall project is, the subdomain is what we call the workspace short name. So this would be like mycompany.8thwall.app/project name. So that short name string is hard coded when you create your 8th Wall workspace, and that gets used with every project. So we definitely recommend that you name that, the name of like your company or your agency, and not something specific to one project that isn't going to be applicable to the next thing you build. So short name.8thwall.app/project name. So many customers want to use a custom vanity domain to override the default URL, mydomain.com or something like that. So Plus, Pro, and Enterprise plans fully support this, but there are a few gotchas that you should be aware of. Really, this just all comes down to how domains and DNS works. These aren't 8th Wall limitations, but the process of connecting a custom domain to your projects is really like 3 steps. First, you specify the domain. Preferably, you'll use a subdomain. We'll talk about why in just a little bit. Second step is you have to verify that you actually own that domain by adding a CNAME record. And thirdly, you'll add a second CNAME record to map the subdomain over to the 8th Wall infrastructure. And we provide you with all the values. If you go to the next slide, where people most commonly get stuck is when trying to connect a root domain, also known as a bare domain or an apex domain. So for example, this would be mydomain.com, without anything in front, Tony.com, for example, without the AR dot or www dot or some subdomain prefix. And we'll get questions like, hey, I'm trying to set up a custom domain and it's telling me to add an A-name record. Well, my DNS provider doesn't support that. Or, I want to create an A record and it requires an IP address. Tell me the IP address of the 8th Wall server. And, neither of those things are really going to work here. So the reason people get stuck is that technically aliasing at the root level of a domain isn't part of the DNS specification. So there are some DNS providers such as AWS Route 53 or Cloudflare's DNS service where they've implemented workarounds to do aliasing at this top level for a domain. But most providers like GoDaddy and a bunch of others don't support it. So an A-name record is also known as an alias record or a CNAME for root domain record. Now, 8th Wall hosting is powered by AWS CloudFront, which is a global CDN that has over 450 points of presence around the globe. And AWS routes users automatically to the best location, out of these 450, and it's continually growing. So there is no single server or single IP address that you can point to. So things like an an A record isn't going to work. So I've got a handful of tips that you should be aware of on the next slide. to consider when you are going to set up a domain. First thing, think about the domain you want to use at the beginning of the project development process, not as the last step. DNS isn't a real-time system, so things like changes can take time to propagate across the rest of the internet for everybody to see it. So definitely don't suggest trying to configure this on like the morning of launch, the day before launch. You can do this at the beginning. Get it set up, get it working the way you want, and then nobody's stressing. Also, because you need to add a couple of simple DNS records to your system, if you're not the DNS administrator, become friends with them, know who this person is. There are some steps in the setup process that are time sensitive. For example, the domain ownership step, you have to complete that in 72 hours, or it fails and you have to delete it and start over again. So the most important tip probably is recommending a subdomain, right? You can always connect a subdomain regardless of your DNS provider. So this would be like ar.mydomain.com or, experience1.mydomain.com, something with a prefix there. Because again, on that previous slide, we talked about, not all DNS providers can do aliasing at the root level. And then if you're going to connect multiple subdomains, you want AR and www and tony.domain.com or whatever you want to put in front. If you're going to connect multiple, do it all at once. You can't edit it after the fact. You would have to delete it and start over again. And then also to check to see the status of things, there's a really handy command line tool called dig, and this allows you to query DNS to see if these records are in place and configured properly. So definitely, take a look at the dig tool documentation. If you have any questions, let us know. So those are two platform-related issues and questions that come up, very regularly from our developer community. And I hope this helps. And now, Evan, I'm going to turn it back over to you to cover other, miscellaneous challenges that developers face.
Thanks, Tony. So in this section, we're going to cover some things to consider when developing your experience that are specific to iOS and a couple other browsers, and then we'll finish it off with just some general debugging tips. So here, this is just a quick plug for Shared AR. If you haven't developed with Shared AR before, definitely recommend that you try it out. We have a lot of templates in our project library now. One thing we've learned from our developers is that it's when getting started, it's kind of difficult to understand the difference between Shared AR and networked A-frame. So just gonna clarify that networked A-frame is the framework used to build multiplayer 3D experiences, just like how A-frame is used to build your 3D experiences, the content itself in normal 8th wall experiences. Networked A-frame is a framework used to build the multiplayer experiences. The Shared AR is simply an adapter that you specify on the scene, and all the networking kind of happens under the covers. So you're just using networked A-frame to build these Shared AR experiences, and then using lobby pages or the invite overlay to integrate 8th wall Shared AR. This is like 90% networked A-frame, and then there's just a couple of lines that you use to integrate 8th wall into your networked A-frame experiences. And linked here are the module and one of our templates if you're interested to learn more about that. Okay, so now we're going to get into some iOS-specific quirks that come up a lot. One being device authorization. If you see a message that looks like one of these two images on the left-hand side of the screen, and in the square here, you can see what the text says. It says a dev token is required to view this page. Visit the 8th wall console to authorize your device. So this indicates that you don't have a developer token on your mobile device. That can happen for a couple of reasons. Perhaps you didn't actually scan the preview QR code in the cloud editor. You might have opened it up in another tab and then, or just like typed in the URL directly. That won't work because the developer token is passed along in the QR code from the preview pane. So if you scan that QR code and you're still seeing these messages, it could be one of these three reasons below. If you're using iOS, you might have intelligent tracking prevention enabled. In your Safari settings, there's a toggle that says prevent cross-site tracking. You need to have that disabled for the token to be passed along through that QR code. You also need to have this block all cookies toggle disabled, since your developer token is stored in a cookie, so that when you reload the page, you don't have to continually obtain a new developer token. And finally, sometimes we see this when you're accessing a device on a new device. You don't already have that cookie stored and you're in incognito mode. And that cookie just can't be obtained from the private session. Next, we're going to look at permission prompts. So this is specific to iOS. When you first load an 8th wall experience from our project library, you're going to see this default screen on the left-hand side. This is injected by our engine to capture a user gesture, so that we can request permission, so that we can request the motion, orientation sensors, and the camera. So this is kind of the sequence of prompts here. There's one additional one on iOS, which is this default screen that we have to capture just to actually request these permissions. You can also implement your own default screen. Here on the right-hand side, you can see we have our custom splash screen. And when the user clicks the Start AR button, they kind of skip that default screen. So you no longer have to have 3 prompts. Instead, you're kind of having one default splash screen, as we call it, and then 2 of the system prompts. So just something to be aware of. If you ever see this screen on iOS, it's because iOS requires that user gesture just to request permissions. Next is similarly, iOS requires a user gesture to play audio of any kind, whether it be background music or a video with sound in your experience. So shown here are 2 different ways of capturing that user gesture. One being the splash screen that we just talked about. On that initial page, you can capture a user gesture when they tap the Start AR button. And then in the event handler of that button click, you can play your audio. Or you can add some sort of element within your AR experience, like on the second GIF here, where you see the play button on this plane. When you click on the play button, you're actually playing the video. Either way, you need to capture a user gesture. Otherwise, you might see black textures or just a static video that's stuck on the first screen. And this would likely only happen on iOS, as other devices and browsers don't have this requirement. So just something to be aware of when you're testing on iOS devices. Next, also similarly, specific to iOS, we have low power mode, which disables autoplay of any kind, whether it be audio or video. So in this case, you need to implement this play button or something in your AR experience that actually directly triggers video playback or audio playback. Even video that is muted, that doesn't have sound, won't autoplay when low power mode is enabled. In these cases, if you do have an autoplay video of some kind in your experience, you can use our low power mode sample project to detect if the user is in low power mode and then dynamically add this element in your scene. In this case, it dynamically adds the play button on top of this plane when the user is in low power mode. So this is a big culprit of a lot of issues that people reach out about. Just because their experience might be working perfectly one day and then they come back later that day or the next day and things just aren't working. A lot of the time it's simply that low power mode is enabled. So this is something important to consider when you're developing experiences with audio and video. Cool. Finally, we just have some general troubleshooting tips for y'all. Here we have kind of an error glossary. These are common errors and warnings that come up. This first one you'll see says invalid timestamps, no DP DB device match, failed to recalculate device parameters. These are all coming from a dependency of A-frame. So these can be ignored for the most part. You'll see these on basically any 8th wall project that's running on an iOS device. It's not anything to worry about. It's really just an informational log. It shouldn't be affecting anything in your code. The second one says incompatible device or browser. This suggests that you're accessing the 8th wall experience from an unsupported device. You set supported devices in code with the XR web component in A-frame. So here in the text, you can see an example is XR web equals allowed devices any. So if you had set this in your code, you wouldn't see this error anymore, but you would see this if you didn't specify allowed devices any and then you tried to access the experience on desktop just because it is considered an unsupported device because it hasn't been specified as an allowed device. Next, we have unsupported token, and it's this left caret. This suggests that you might be using a Draco compressed model, but you have not specified the Draco decoder path or upgraded to A-frame 1.4.1. So it's a good idea to upgrade your A-frame version to 1.4.1. This is one of the enhancements that comes along with that version of A-frame. You no longer have to specify a Draco decoder path, and you shouldn't see this error at all if you're using A-frame 1.4.1. If you do see this though, one thing to check would be your models. Check if they're using Draco compression. Okay, we have two more common errors for you on the next slide. This first one is related to audio and video. Not allowed error. This is thrown, for example, if the user is in low power mode and you're trying to autoplay a muted video. This can also happen if you're trying to autoplay sound, which is not allowed on iOS. So this indicates an issue with autoplay of some sort, whether it be audio or video. And you can reference the earlier threads on low power or the earlier slides on playing audio and low power mode to fix this. Finally, we have this no valid session manager to handle this session error. And this typically comes from a combination of allowed devices and auto-loaded image targets. So there are certain restrictions with auto-loaded image targets on what devices you can open that experience on. If you do use auto-loaded image targets, you should really only be launching that experience on a mobile device that can detect those image targets. Otherwise, you might run into an error like this, where you've specified allowed devices any. You also have auto-loaded image targets, which is confusing the engine because the desktop device isn't really able to detect those auto-loaded image targets when there's not an active camera feed. So something to be aware of, if you are using a world effect experience and you want to use metaversal deployment, you'll have to load those image targets manually using the XR controller API. So if you see no valid session manager, it's a good idea to check your image targets, see if you need to delete any or load those manually. Cool, and then I have one final slide here on debugging using the console. So the cloud editor comes with a streamed console at the bottom of the IDE. This is really convenient for checking for warnings or errors at a glance on your mobile devices, so you don't actually have to plug in your device and open up Safari or Chrome, look at the browser tools there. However, it is limited, especially in terms of object inspection and looking at data and events, things like that. So if you're looking to get more granular information, you do need to use the browser console. In this example, I'm logging in the event detail from one of our engine lifecycle methods, XR image found. So when an image target is detected, that event is emitted on the scene. Here, I'm just logging that event, and you can see the difference in the output from the streamed console versus the output from the browser console. So in the browser console, this event is actually interactive. I can expand it and inspect the actual event detail and the position that comes in that event detail. Whereas in the streamed console, I'm just seeing an object that says is trusted false. So this is a case where, I'd really want to and need to use the browser console to inspect this object in more detail. We get a lot of questions about this is trusted false object. This is just kind of a limitation of the streamed console. Really, you should be using the browser console to inspect and obtain more granular information like this. Cool. And that's it for our general debugging tips. So now I believe we're moving into Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony, Evan, and Ian, for that awesome presentation. We do have a couple questions that were pre-submitted as we sent out a form for everyone to fill out if they had questions. And then we do have 3 questions coming in from the Zoom Q&A. So 4 now. So we'll do our best to move through these in the remaining 14 minutes we have left. So first off, this is related to kind of like multi-deployment. So just going to read this out for you all, and then please answer accordingly. So how do you prepare calibration among tons of mobile devices? For example, recent web environment does not give users device model information. I found that 8Vault detect mobile devices, mobile model information by group, separated by certain criteria, like device resolution or DPR info. Every year, new brand and mobile devices are emerging. How do you manage the AR calibration?
Yeah, I can take that one. That's a great question. So, yeah, we were aware of some of the like user agent string changes in some recent browser updates, and we've actually made some updates to the engine accordingly to deal with these types of things. So, we also have a a large library of phones that we purchase, and we use these as part of the QA processes. And when updates happen to the engine, we test things, and we're regularly updating things to make sure that AR is working properly on as many devices as possible. So if you have any specific issues or questions about a particular phone model, I would suggest reaching out to support at 8Wall. But we've seen cases where, this particular phone is selecting the wrong camera. That was kind of a classic symptom of these user agent string and like device model information changes in the browser. And I want to say it was maybe the last engine update where we've made some a number of improvements there to make sure it does the right thing here. So.
Awesome. The next question is related. So for tracking or rendering ability in WebAR, are there any differences between Samsung and iPhone?
Great question. I mean, they all, the thing with 8Wall is, we're just using web standard, APIs. So, get user media and all of that. And these frameworks that we integrate with, A-Frame, 3JS, and so on, they're cross-platform and they support these as well. I mean, I would say, probably in general, if you take the latest iPhone and take the latest Samsung phone and look at their Geekbench scores, like the iPhone is generally going to be quite a bit faster is what we see. So, you might get higher frame rates or things like that. But from a, overall, tracking and rendering ability, I would expect, similar performance on older phones that are really slow or have 1 or 2 frames per second because maybe they're 5 or 6 years old. I mean, that definitely will have an impact on tracking stability because we can't pull in the camera feeds to track as much. But that's just kind of a result of really old devices. And we've done as much optimization of the engine as we can to make it run as fast and smooth on as many devices across the board as possible.
Got it. And it seems like a final follow-up to that is, do they have to use different file types based off of the model device? And should they separate those?
Yeah, I can quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna quickly say that we suggest GLB model type, and that's gonna work via Android and iOS. I know USDZ is kind of native iOS AR viewer file type, but yeah, there's no need to separate it if you use GLB on the cloud editor with 8Wall.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So moving on. This is 3D files. So Ian, this is probably going to be all you this time around. But what is the latest best method for preparing 3D files for WebAR? For example, when speaking to 3D designers, how can I explain the 3D model exporting process for the WebAR who has zero knowledge in WebAR?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of information in our documentation and online in general. And I mean, building for AR experiences, a lot of the same concepts for 3D modeling in general apply. And so, I mean, you're gonna have the same concepts of polygon count, you're gonna have, textures. These are all kind of common 3D modeling things that are used in all different types of industries. One main thing for WebAR is that this is going to be a web page. And so, as I stated, you're going to want to optimize textures and reduce polygon counts. And we have a lot of documentation about this in 8th Wall. And I think just kind of a better understanding of how polygon counts and textures all work together is important when building.
Yeah, I think, Ian, to add on to that, and it's also kind of related to the next question is, there's no like specific size as far as a limit goes. Unfortunately, there's so many different types of phones. They all have different performance and memory characteristics. So, the general guidance is just make this as small as possible, right? That maximizes your compatibility. And if, to find that number, it's like, okay, shrink the textures a little bit, shrink them a little bit more, shrink them a third time. And then, if you go too far, oh, it doesn't look good enough, maybe you revert that latest change. So, Ian kind of gave some guidance on, 2K or lower textures. I always say, use the smallest you possibly can, not just for performance reasons, but also that has impact on, things like page load time. The browser is going to download less data here. The performance one, yeah, I mean, you can set guidelines about, X number of years, but again, there's such a wide array of devices. I can buy a 1-year-old Android device that's cost $50 and it might be slower than a, 7-year-old iPhone, right? So there's no guarantee that, even a 1 or 2-year-old phone, especially on the Android side of the house, is going to be, a certain speed because, there's so many different chips and performance characteristics. So, what you can do, another thing you can do is you can design an experience. So, if you query for type of device, you could consider, well, oh, if I know this is on an iPhone or on this particular model, maybe I load the higher quality asset. And if it's another type of device or I don't know what it is really, maybe you load a lower quality version of that asset just to be safe. So these are some things you can do as well.
Yeah, and another thing to note too is, it's also the complexity of the experience. So let's say you just have a really high quality, high polygon count of a model that's just static in a world effects experience. That's more than likely going to run pretty well on a lot of phones. But let's say you want to add real-time physics, you want objects hitting off that mesh and bouncing around, that's going to be a lot more processing power. So maybe you're going to think about reducing that polygon count. So again, it's just, it's kind of overall your experience and what you're trying to create and take that into a thought while you're creating your 3D models.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you all so much for answering that. Next up, we're going to the live Q&A from Zoom. So Rory, if you're still in the chat, love to hear you ask your question.
Oh, yeah. Hey guys, this is great. Thanks so much for doing this. I think you pretty much just answered most of that question with the question in advance. I guess I'm just used to doing stuff in Unity. Can you use multiple textures with models, or you just keep it to a single texture for this stuff?
Yeah. Happy to answer this one. So yeah, I suggest using multiple textures depending on how good you want your model to look. So you can certainly add normal maps, you can add roughness and metallic maps, and a base color map. So you could have 6 different texture maps for a specific 3D model. But again, it's kind of a balancing act, right? So if I want that normal map, I want that metallic roughness map and a base color map, maybe I'm going to make those all 512 by 512 texture sizes. But let's say I have an experience where I have a globe or a world where I want people to get really close, and maybe I want a 4K texture. Maybe I just want one single texture. So again, it does depend on kind of the experience, but you can certainly add multiple textures to a single 3D model.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Next, we have a question from Lois. If you're still around and like to ask, please feel free to unmute. Give it a couple seconds. All right, Evan, this is related to accuracy of Wayspot. So what is the accuracy of Wayspot with fair quality? Seems like they get an error, XR project Wayspot's lost when using that.
Yeah. So regarding the accuracy of wayspots that have this fair tag on them in the geospatial browser, and if others aren't aware, the geospatial browser is kind of a map that you can explore and find wayspots around you to use in your AR experiences. And when you look at those wayspots, some of them will say good or fair based on like how many meshes and the quality of the meshes available. So these wayspots that have this fair tag on them are expected to like work not as well as ones that have the good tag, and this is just based on, again, the number of scans and the quality of scans. So if you see a waystspot that is labeled as fair, you might want to take a couple more scans of the waystspot and reactivate the waystspot, try and get it up to good or like a better quality than it currently is. You won't truly know until you're actually testing the waste spot in person on site. So I definitely recommend doing that early. You can test localization through the Wayfair app, or even better, just start with the VPS template from our project library, swap out the waste spot, add the mesh on, and then you can kind of visualize localization yourself. And that visualizing localization is outlined in our VPS quick tips tutorial on YouTube. So if you watch that, it shows you how you can kind of place the mesh downloaded from the geospatial browser over the real world location. And that's really the best way to test quality, rather than just depending on these good and fair tags that show up in the geospatial browser. And the second part of this, this XR project Wayspot Lost event, is only fired when absolutely none of the Wayspot is detected in the frame, in the camera feed. World tracking does take over after initial localization, so it's not going to fire immediately when the Wayspot is lost. But if you turn your camera away and wait a few seconds, this event should fire. It's not going to fire immediately when you look away from the Wayspot, as world tracking has kind of taken over, and relocalization only happens every couple of seconds.
Awesome, thank you. And then we'll have time for one more question here. This is from Aditya Patel. If you'd like to read your question, please feel free to unmute. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and read it to the team. Cool. All right. So this is regarding updates to any sort of 8th wall experience. They're having an issue with some clearing their cache and cookies, and then that tends to see the older version of the application running on that browser. Is there a quicker, convenient way to avoid this?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'm looking at the question here. Well, one thing to mention, the question asked about sharing a test link with someone else. So generally, if you're using the cloud editor and you're scanning the preview QR code, that's kind of a private, unique URL to you as the developer. I don't recommend actually sharing that URL, because nobody else is going to be able to view that unless they also scan the preview QR code and have that developer token that Evan mentioned earlier. So if you want to share URLs with a client, for example, that's really a great opportunity to land your code and publish the password protected staging URL. And then that's like really the kind of recommended way to share what you're building with external folks. Now, as far as hey, I update my project and I don't see the updates, that is strange. I don't recall hearing other reports of that. So if you have, maybe you can share offline, email support@8thwall.com with some specifics about the project, your location, the type of phone, and things like that. When you build, when you develop in the cloud editor and you like add new assets or you change code, we're rebuilding things. New assets are actually pushed to CDN with like unique file names that have unique hashes in them. So it's not going to, if you replace a 3D model or an image, your phone doesn't have that cache, because the next time you reload it, it'll have a new file name. It could maybe be something to do with like, time for the change to propagate to wherever you are in the world, might take a moment or two, or things like that, but hard to say without some more specifics.
Awesome. Great. Well, as a reminder, you can always reach out to the AFOL support team at support@afol.com for any additional questions. Also join the Dev Slack for some help. You can definitely search through some of the previously posted questions there and find some answers. But with that, I'd love to thank everyone so much for being here.